Hello, my name's Tom Palmer and I'm a children's author, and this is a special 20-minute film for Moon Lane TV. I'm delighted to be one of the authors working with the Moon Lane bookshops to bring you, I suppose, to tell you a bit about my books, how I write, what I write. Anyway, just to give you a bit of context, I've done a few. I write history books as well as football books. And some of the history books which have come out in the last while are these ones. There's Armistice Runner, which is about a girl called Lily, who is a fell runner, so a cross-country runner, but it also relates to her great-great-granddad, who was involved in the First World War. D-Day Dog, which is a story about a paradog, a parachuting dog called Len, who was deployed as a parachuting dog in the Second World War. And also more recently, the book that came out about less than a year ago is After the War, which is about a group of children who survived the Holocaust and came to live in England, in the Lake District in England. And this is a picture of some of them. And they came to live by Lake Windermere. And this is a story of refugees 76 years ago, and it's about what it was like for them coming to this country, having been through awful situations during the Second World War. But I'm not here to talk about them. I'm here to talk about Arctic Star, which is my new book, and thank you very much for Moon Lane TV for giving me this chance to talk about it. So Arctic Star is about the Navy in the Second World War. In my other books, I've written about the Royal Air Force, the Army, but never the Navy. And my wife spotted this with my books, that I've done quite a few books about war now, but not about the Navy. And my wife actually used to work on a ship called Hms Belfast. And in my Arctic Star scrapbook, because I keep a scrapbook of every book that I write now, there's a picture of HMS Belfast. And you might have been on it. If you've been to London, you can actually visit HMS Belfast, because it's moored on the River Thames and it's part of the Imperial War Museum. You can actually visit it and look round it. I wanted to write a story about that because my wife said she used to work on it, and that she said there weren't that many children's books about the Navy, and it's true, there aren't that many children's books about the Royal Navy, particularly with the First and Second World War. There's quite a lot of books to do with the First World War and trench warfare, and quite a lot of books to do with airmen in the Second World War, but not so much to do with shipping. So I thought I'd write that. So how did I go about it? Well, I suppose the first thing I did was I needed to find a story. I couldn't just write a story about a ship. So I had to think about what did HMS Belfast actually do? How was it involved? And so I looked into the history of that ship, and I discovered that it was involved in a really famous battle on Boxing Day in 1943, which was called the Battle of North Cape. And that battle took place, I can show you on this map. This is the I'll just do it so you can see it. This is the UK here, where we live, and we used to have to deliver material, so aeroplanes, tanks, fuel, ammunition, to the Russians, who are our allies. But we couldn't do it in the Second World War. We couldn't do it through Germany because we were at war with Germany. So what we did is we sailed up to Iceland and then across round the top of Norway to the northern Arctic ports of Russia and delivered that material to them there. And we had to do that. And the Germans obviously wanted to stop us doing that because they wanted to carry on doing what they were doing across Europe. But the British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Russians and many others joined in to stop Nazi Germany doing what it was doing. And that is what HMS Belfast was involved in something called the Arctic convoys. And the Arctic convoys were those ships sailing all the way up to Iceland and across and down to the Russian Arctic ports. And they sailed in convoys of about 50 ships. Most of the ships were just like container ships taking material, but alongside them they were escorted by Royal Navy ships like HMS Belfast, and that's what the characters in this story are doing. So I didn't just write about the whole ship's life. I didn't just write about the whole crew. I chose particular people in the crew. So I chose 3 young sailors, and I chose the youngest sailors I could find to write about, because this is a children's book, so it's important I write about as young people as possible. So these were teenagers who were off to sea, and these are some of the conditions that they faced. And again, these photographs, there's some copies of these actually in the book, but these photographs I'm going to show you were lent to us by the Imperial War Museum. So there's photos like that, and photographs like that ship carving its way through the seas. But then it was very cold, so as well as stormy seas these sailors had to go through, they also had to face German U-boats, that's submarines, or massive battleships attacking them, and German aeroplanes trying to dive bomb them, and they also had to fight against the ice. So this is a picture of some of the sailors with, you see how it's all iced up around them, and that's another one, just like the ships used to just get covered in ice. And one of the jobs the sailors had to do is clear the ice off the top of the ship, because if they didn't clear all the ice off the ship would become top heavy and it would capsize, and they'd, like most of them or all of them, would be killed. And so I wanted to write a story about what it was like. What would it be like if you were like 18 years old and you went off on a ship on one of those missions in the stormy seas with the Germans trying to sink your ship and the other ships, and ice and sea and all those monstrous things going on? It must have been really frightening. And so I wanted to write about that, because frankly I couldn't get my head around it, just like I can't get my head around what it's like jumping out of an aeroplane with your dog with parachutes to try and win a war. What would it be like sailing through the worst and most stormy seas to try and win a war? So, and I was trying to see it from the point of view of those young sailors. So in doing that, I need to do a lot of research. So how do I find out? Well, what I can do is I can read other books that cover that period of history. So these are actually 3 books. One's by a Norwegian author, one's by a German author, and one is by a Dutch author. I read stories of other people, not to steal their ideas, but to understand what it was like to be in those convoys, and to try and write about it better, and also to make sure my book is very different to their book, so that I'm not covering the same territory. Another thing, I've got stories here, but I need to know what's it like from the point of view of one of the sailors. So what I do is I go onto the Imperial War Museum's website, and you can search, and you can find out, like, if you search like wherever you're from, you could search the name of your town. Like, I'm from Halifax, so I could search Halifax, Second World War, and it would come up with the recordings of soldiers, sailors and airmen who came from my town talking about their experience in the war. And so that's what I did. I put in Arctic convoys, Second World War, and I found lots of interviews with sailors, and I listened to their interviews, and I wrote down countless notes, well, not countless, but loads and loads of notes, having listened to the interviews of all these sailors from the Second World War who took part in the Arctic convoys. So that gave me an idea about my characters and the stories. But one other thing was lacking for me was vocabulary. So when I write books, like, I'm quite good. No, not quite good. That sounds a bit too much full of myself. I'm confident writing about football. I've been to hundreds of football matches. I've played in hundreds of football matches. So I understand the vocabulary of football. So if you read my football books, you'll probably see that I appear to know what I'm talking about. And I probably do, because I'm into football. And if you write about what you're interested in, it's going to sound authentic, isn't it? But I'm not authentic when it comes to the sea. I live in Halifax, so the place where I live is, you either have to drive or get the train for an hour, an hour and a half, 2 hours or more, either way, to go to the sea. I am not from a seafaring community. If you are from a seafaring community, like if you live in Portsmouth, or on the Clyde, or in anywhere like where there is a lot of people who've been to sea and their family have been to sea, you will have a better vocabulary of the sea. I have a really poor vocabulary of the sea, or I did. until I thought, right, I need to improve my vocabulary of the sea and make it as strong as my vocabulary of football. So I got this book. This book is called The Oxford Book of the Sea, and it's edited by Jonathan Raban, or Rayban, I'm not quite sure how to say his name. And I read through this, and it's got in it descriptions of the sea by poets, novelists, and essayists and other writers through the years who've described the sea, from the Bible to the modern day. So you've got like hundreds, thousands of years of descriptions of the sea. And I went through this book and I underlined things. And you can do that if it's your own book. You're allowed to underline things if you want to. Some people think it's appalling, but I do it. But you don't have to do it. And I underlined all these words, and I got myself a vocabulary of about 50 to 60 to 70 words and phrases that I could use to do with the sea. And I put a lot of that into there. So hopefully this really sounds like you are at sea, because I've done my research, not only done my research into what my characters went through, but also to the vocabulary and the words they might have used to describe the sea. So I'm hoping if you read this, you will see lots of phrases, metaphors as well, that make it really feel like you're at sea. That was my plan. Anyway, so they're like, that's how I go about writing a book. I get an idea, I do my research, I read around the subject. I also watched films. So one film I watched is called Greyhound, and it's a film, I think it's directed by and certainly acted in by Tom Hanks, who's a really well-known actor, and that was really useful because although it wasn't about the Arctic convoys, which is what I'm writing about, it was about the Atlantic convoys, which were similar in some ways. And so I watch films, I go on the Imperial War Museum website, I read books, I go to museums. I went for a tour of HMS Belfast. When you actually go to HMS Belfast, there's a map, and a plan, and you can go to all the different places. And those places feature in my story. Anyway, I'm gonna read you a bit now, because that's what you're supposed to do, isn't it, when you do an event about a book. And I'm going to read you from chapter 1. So Frank is a young sailor, and he's being sent out of the ship to chip the ice off the deck, because if he doesn't, the ship will capsize and sink, and he and all his shipmates will die. So his job is to do this, and it's not very pleasant, as you will see. And this, as I say, this is based on me listening to recordings of old sailors telling these stories. So hopefully it feels authentic to you. I'll read you a bit, and then I'm going to show you something else, something that I think is really interesting, but we'll see if you think it's interesting. Chapter 1, The Norwegian Sea, October 1943. You do know that some men who go out on the deck to clear ice are never seen again, don't you? Frank took a deep breath, ignoring his friend Stephen's remark, to focus on preparing himself for what was coming next. The wind, the waves, the danger. Frank had a hammer and chisel in one hand, while his other hand gripped the thick steel wire that ran the length of the ship from bow to stern, there for men to hold on to in rough weather. He could already feel its freezing cold metal through his thick woolen Arctic gloves as the wind roared wildly around him. HMS Forget-Me-Not rolled into another deep trough between the waves, forcing Frank to reset his feet as the angle of the deck shifted again. And then the ice-chipping team were on the move. Frank, Joseph and Stephen staggered forwards into a storm, attached to each other by a rope, a lifeline. Frank went first, ignoring the nausea of his seasickness. He was immediately struck by a blast of wind so cold it was impossible to breathe. His lungs just couldn't take in the freezing air. He felt his feet slip from underneath him on the icy deck. This was madness, but the lifeline did its job, as did his two friends. Frank stayed upright, just. Out in the open, the wind, the wild ocean rolled and roared and thumped at the side of the ship's metal hull. Frank felt grateful for the warm clothing of his Arctic kit as shards of ice hit him like a hail of bullets. There was a name for this ice, spindrift. like there was a name for everything at sea. It was created as the wind whipped off the surface of the tops of the waves and froze into hard, sharp particles. Frank flinched from the spindrift, but kept moving. If he didn't, he knew that over the next hour, ice would build up on the deck of the ship, freezing the guns, the lifeboats, the racks of explosive depth charges. Then HMS Forget-Me-Not would become top-heavy and capsize, pitching them all into the sea. The entire 85-man crew would be dead within minutes. Out of the corner of his eye, Frank could see some of the other 47 ships in the Arctic convoy. No doubt junior sailors like him were having to do the same terrifying job on their decks as they battled through the storm. Frank kept his body low to balance as he approached the guardrail, which was like a metal fence that ran round the edge of the deck to prevent sailors from falling overboard. He glanced back to see Joseph holding on to his lifeline with a determined look on his face. Then Frank began to attack the build-up of ice. As he did so, the ship seemed to bounce off the waves, making it difficult to keep his footing and raise the hammer, then bring it down on the chisel. But Frank had to keep going. He'd found that work and keeping busy was the best way to flush away his fear. Using every muscle and sinew in his body, Frank focused on keeping his balance and driving his chisel into the ridges of ice. He made good progress. Chunks were coming away, some the size of his sea boots. He had the angle of his chisel right and was timing his strikes too, waiting for HMS Forget-Me-Not to crest a wave and striking down with his hammer before the ship lunged into a trough. It was all about timing. That was the trick. He took out another 5 or 6 large chunks of ice before it happened. 1 minute, his hammer was raised to strike. The next, the deck went from under him and he hit his back on something, his head on something else. Then he was falling, somersaulting downwards. Instinctively, Frank let go of the hammer and chisel, hoping they wouldn't spin into the air and take a lump out of him. Then he felt a sudden shock of cold and wet, took in a lungful of freezing salty seawater while trying to move his arms. But his heavy overcoat made that impossible. Really, Frank had no idea what was up or what was down, where the surface of the sea was, where the sky was. But one thing he did know, he was overboard in the sea. Frank felt terror, his heart pounding inside his chest, his throat gasping for air. Submerged beneath the water, Frank could feel his overcoat and boots becoming heavier and heavier, weighing him down like there was a hand coming from the depths of the Norwegian sea to drag him to his death. As he fought for every breath, for his life, Frank could feel the cold the sailors had told him about when a man went overboard, a violent shivering, a numbness, the slowing of the heart. It was a quick death, they had said, not a terrible death, so long as you just gave into it. Soon, Frank's exhaustion overcame him, and he stopped fighting. And that's the beginning of Arctic Star, and it's very much based on what I've listened to, the testimony of the men who went through those experiences. And as I've already explained, I captured all that in my notebook, and I also captured quite a lot of what I was trying to find out in my scrapbook as well. And there's just some amazing photographs on the Imperial War Museum of what it must have been like to be at sea and at war. And the last thing I wanted to show you before I finish this film is book covers. So this book cover, I think, is one of the finest book covers I've had for any of my books. But book covers don't just happen as a one-off. They sort of evolve. And I wanted to show you, if I can find it, the 4 sort of stages of the book cover as they came into existence. So you've got all 4 there, and hopefully you can see them all there. Obviously, you can see it was going to be called The War at Sea, and as you can see there, the waves aren't that rough. It doesn't look that wild a sea, and there it's starting to look a bit rougher. There's a bit more ice in the sea, and then there the title changes, and eventually that is the final cover. And there's not massive differences, but if you look at it, I should do a spot the difference, shouldn't I? That'd be quite a good thing to do. Anyway, that's Arctic Star. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Moonlane TV for giving me this opportunity to talk about Arctic Star. Thank you.